The winter that never ended, the 1949 blizzard that plunged America into weeks of darkness. It was the winter that refused to leave, the winter that buried homes, silenced highways, and tested the endurance of an entire nation. The winter of 1949. Chapter 1. The Last Ordinary Morning. January 1949 began like any other winter in the American heartland. Farmers in Nebraska woke before dawn, their boots crunching against the frozen earth as they made their way to barns filled with livestock waiting to be fed. In Wyoming, ranchers checked their fences and counted their cattle, grateful for a season that had been cold but manageable. Across the northern plains, from the Dakotas to Montana, families gathered around kitchen tables, sharing coffee and conversation before the day's work began. The radio played softly in the background. Weather reports mentioned snow moving in from the northwest, but nothing unusual. Snow was expected, snow was normal. This was the American West in winter. After all, in the small town of Valentine, Nebraska, a woman named Dorothy Hendricks stood at her window, watching her children play in the yard. The sky was gray but calm. Her husband, Robert, had left early that morning to check on cattle in the north pasture, promising to return before lunch. She had no reason to worry. The thermometer read 28 degrees, cold, but not dangerous. 300 miles to the west in Cheyenne, Wyoming, a young schoolteacher named Margaret Collins prepared her classroom for the day ahead. 23 students would soon fill the wooden desks, their faces red from the cold, their laughter echoing through the hallways. She wrote the date on the chalkboard, January 2nd, 1949, a new year, a fresh start. In Rapid City, South Dakota, a livestock hauler named Thomas Garrett loaded his truck with supplies. He had a delivery to make to a ranch 50 miles north. The roads were clear. The job would take half a day at most. He kissed his wife goodbye, told her he would be home for dinner, and climbed into the cab of his truck. None of them knew what was coming. None of them could have known. The storm that would soon descend upon them was not a single event, but a relentless series of blizzards that would last for weeks. It would bury entire towns under drifts 30 feet high. It would strand thousands of travelers on highways that disappeared beneath walls of white. It would trap families in their homes for days without food, without heat, without hope. It would become known as the winter of 1949, the most devastating series of blizzards in American history. But on that first morning of January, the sky was simply gray, the wind was simply cold, and the people of the northern plains went about their lives, unaware that everything was about to change. The first flakes began to fall around noon. They were light at first, almost gentle, drifting down from a sky that had darkened to the color of slate. Dorothy Hendricks called her children inside, helped them remove their wet mittens, and set a pot of soup on the stove. Robert would be hungry when he returned, but Robert did not return. By 2 o'clock, the wind had shifted. What had been a gentle snowfall became something else entirely. The flakes grew thicker, faster, driven sideways by gusts that rattled the windows and howled through the gaps in the doorframe. Visibility dropped to a few feet. The world outside the window became a swirling wall of white. Dorothy tried to remain calm. Robert knew this land. He had worked it for 15 years. He would find shelter. He would wait out the storm, but as the hours passed and darkness fell, the temperature plummeted. The wind screamed across the open prairie with a fury she had never heard before. The house groaned under the assault. The fire in the stove struggled to keep the single room warm. Her children asked when their father would come home. She told them soon. She told them he was safe. She told them not to worry. She did not believe her own words. Across the region, the same scene played out in thousands of homes. Husbands who had left for routine errands did not return. Children who had walked to school found themselves trapped in buildings as the storm erased the roads. Travelers who had set out on familiar highways discovered that those highways had vanished beneath drifts that grew higher with every passing hour. The blizzard of January 2nd, 1949 was only the beginning. In Cheyenne, Margaret Collins watched through the frost-covered windows of her classroom as the world disappeared. The children had been scheduled to leave at 3 o'clock. By 2:30, the principal made the decision to keep them overnight. Parents could not reach them. Buses could not navigate the streets. The school became a refuge, its hallways filled with frightened children and anxious teachers who did their best to maintain calm. Margaret organized games. She told stories. She rationed the crackers and milk from the cafeteria. She assured her students that their parents were safe, that help would come, that everything would be fine. She spent that night sleeping in a chair, listening to the wind tear at the building, praying that the old walls would hold. Thomas Garrett never made it to his destination. 15 miles north of Rapid City, his truck became stuck in a drift that seemed to materialize from nowhere. One moment the road was visible, the next it was gone. He tried to dig out, but the wind filled the hole faster than he could clear it. The snow accumulated around the truck, burying the wheels, then the doors, then the windows. He had no choice but to wait. He ran the engine in short intervals to keep warm, rationing his fuel, hoping that someone would find him before it ran out. He had food for 1 day, maybe 2. Water was not a problem. He could melt snow, but the cold was relentless, seeping through the metal walls of the cab, numbing his fingers and toes despite his heavy clothing. He thought about his wife. He thought about the dinner she was preparing. He thought about all the things he should have said that morning and did not. The first night passed, then the second. The storm showed no signs of stopping. Across the northern plains, a catastrophe was unfolding. Roads that had been cleared were buried again within hours. Power lines snapped under the weight of ice and wind. Communication systems failed. Entire communities found themselves cut off from the outside world, isolated islands in a sea of white. And still the snow fell. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If stories of human endurance, of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges, speak to something deep within you, then you belong here. Subscribe now, because the story is only beginning. Chapter 2. The Siege Begins by January 5th. 1949. The full scope of the disaster was becoming clear. This was not a single storm but a siege. Wave after wave of blizzards rolled across the northern plains, each one burying whatever had been dug out from the last. The accumulation was staggering. In some areas, snowfall totals exceeded 100 inches. Drifts climbed to 30 feet, 40 feet, burying barns and homes up to their rooftops. The infrastructure of the region collapsed under the assault. Railroads, the lifelines of commerce and communication, ground to a halt. Locomotives equipped with massive rotary plows tried to clear the tracks, but found themselves overwhelmed. The snow was too deep, too dense, too relentless. Trains became stranded in the middle of nowhere, their passengers trapped for days without adequate food or heat. On the Union Pacific line between Cheyenne and Laramie, a passenger train carrying 127 people became stuck in a drift on January 4th. The conductor made the decision to keep the passengers aboard rather than risk exposure to the elements. For 3 days they rationed food, shared blankets, and waited for rescue. When help finally arrived, many of the passengers were suffering from frostbite and hypothermia. All of them were alive. It was considered a miracle. Not everyone was so fortunate. In the rural areas where farms and ranches were separated by miles of open land, the isolation was complete. Telephone lines were down. Roads were impassable. Families who had prepared for a normal winter found themselves facing a catastrophe that exceeded anything in their experience. The livestock toll was devastating. Cattle, sheep, and horses that had been grazing in open pastures when the storm hit had no chance. They were buried where they stood, frozen solid within hours. Others sought shelter in low-lying areas and draws, only to be covered by drifts that entombed them. When spring finally came and the snow melted, ranchers would discover the bodies of their animals stacked in grotesque piles, preserved by the cold, a silent testament to the ferocity of the winter. But in January, the full extent of the livestock losses was unknown. Ranchers could not reach their herds. They could only wait and hope. Robert Hendricks was one of those ranchers. He had been caught in the open when the first storm hit, miles from home, miles from shelter. He had tried to make it back, following fence lines that he knew by heart, but the wind and snow had erased every landmark. The world had become a uniform white, a featureless void, in which direction meant nothing. He found a small depression in the land, a slight hollow that offered minimal protection from the wind. He hunkered down, pulling his coat tight, trying to conserve body heat. He thought about Dorothy. He thought about his children. He prayed that they were safe, that they had enough wood for the fire, that they would not worry too much. The first night was the hardest. The cold was a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on him, seeping into his bones, slowing his thoughts. He forced himself to move, to flex his fingers and toes, to stay awake. Sleep meant death. He knew this. Every rancher on the plains knew this. When dawn finally came, the storm had not abated. If anything, it had intensified. Robert could see nothing beyond a few feet. The snow was waist-deep and still falling. He had no food, no water, no way to make fire. He began to walk. He did not know which direction he was going. He simply moved, putting one foot in front of the other, refusing to surrender. He walked for hours, though he lost track of time. The cold had numbed his extremities. His face was a mask of frost, but he kept moving. Late in the afternoon, he stumbled upon a fence line. He did not recognize it, but it did not matter. Fences led somewhere. He followed it, hand over hand, using the wire as a guide through the blinding white. The fence led him to a barn. The barn was empty, its animals long since brought inside by whatever family owned it, but it offered shelter from the wind. Robert collapsed inside, exhausted beyond measure, but alive. He spent 2 days in that barn, surviving on melted snow and the last reserves of his strength. On the third day, when the storm briefly paused, he set out again, following the fence in the opposite direction. It led him to a farmhouse where a family whose name he did not know took him in, fed him, and tended to his frostbitten hands and feet. He would lose 2 toes to that storm, but he would live. Dorothy Hendricks did not learn of her husband's survival for another week. In those 7 days, she kept the fire burning, rationed their food, and told her children stories to keep them calm. She did not allow herself to cry in front of them. She did not allow herself to despair. When Robert finally made it home, carried in the back of a neighbor's truck that had managed to break through the drifts, she met him at the door. They held each other for a long time, saying nothing because there was nothing that needed to be said. Across the region, similar stories of survival and loss played out. Communities that had been rivals became allies. Neighbors who had barely spoken helped dig each other out. The disaster brought out the worst of nature but the best of humanity. In small towns throughout Nebraska, Wyoming, and the Dakotas, people organized rescue parties. They used whatever they had available: horses, tractors, even their own bodies, wading through chest-deep snow to reach stranded families. They carried food and medicine to those who could not get out. They opened their homes to strangers. The federal government was slow to respond. In 1949, there was no FEMA, no coordinated disaster response system. The military eventually mobilized, sending aircraft to drop supplies to isolated communities and bulldozers to clear roads, but it took time. Too much time, many would later say. In the meantime, ordinary people did extraordinary things. A group of ranchers near Chadron, Nebraska, formed a rescue brigade using horses to reach families stranded on remote homesteads. They traveled through conditions that would have been considered impassable, guided by instinct and determination. Over the course of 2 weeks, they reached more than 40 families, delivering food, medicine, and hope. In Gillette, Wyoming, the owner of a small general store opened his doors to anyone who needed shelter. He gave away food and supplies without keeping track, trusting that people would repay him when they could. Most did. Some could not. He never complained. In Pierre, South Dakota, a group of high school students organized a volunteer corps to shovel out elderly residents whose homes had been buried. They worked from dawn until dark, asking nothing in return except the knowledge that they had helped. These acts of kindness, repeated thousands of times across the affected region, would become the enduring legacy of the winter of 1949. Not the death toll, though that was significant, not the property damage, though that was immense, but the response of ordinary people to an extraordinary crisis. Chapter 3. The Breaking Point. By mid-January, the situation had become critical. The series of storms showed no sign of ending. Each brief respite was followed by another onslaught. The accumulated snow was unlike anything in living memory. Old-timers who had survived the harsh winters of the 1880s said this was worse, much worse. The livestock crisis dominated the headlines. Across the northern plains, an estimated 1 million cattle were at risk. Many had already perished, buried in drifts or frozen in the open. Those that survived were starving. Hay supplies that had seemed adequate for a normal winter were running out. Ranchers who had spent their lives building their herds watched helplessly as their animals weakened and died. The psychological toll was immense. These were people who had faced hardship before: drought, depression, war. They were not strangers to struggle, but this was different. This was relentless. Day after day, week after week, the storms kept coming. The snow kept falling, and there was nothing they could do but endure. In the town of Alliance, Nebraska, a farmer named Harold Peterson made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His cattle were dying. He had no more hay. The roads were impassable. He could not get feed in, and he could not get his animals out. On January 15th, he walked out to his pasture with a rifle. He spent the morning doing what he believed was the merciful thing, ending the suffering of animals that would otherwise starve slowly. By noon, he had fired 47 times. That evening, he sat alone in his kitchen, unable to eat, unable to speak, unable to reconcile what he had done with the man he believed himself to be. Harold Peterson was not alone in his anguish. Across the region, ranchers faced the same impossible choices. Some tried to keep their animals alive through sheer force of will, hand-feeding them whatever they could find, melting snow for water, sheltering them in barns already overcrowded. Some succeeded, many did not. The human cost was also mounting. While the death toll from the blizzards remained relatively low compared to the scale of the disaster, people were dying. Motorists stranded on highways, farmers caught in the open, elderly residents whose homes lost heat. Each death was a tragedy, a life cut short by a force of nature that seemed without mercy. In Rapid City, Thomas Garrett was finally rescued on January 8th, 6 days after his truck became stuck. A military helicopter spotted the vehicle, nearly invisible beneath the snow only by chance. When rescuers dug him out, he was barely conscious, his fuel long exhausted, his body ravaged by cold and hunger. He spent 3 weeks in the hospital recovering from severe frostbite. He would lose several fingers but keep his life. His wife visited him every day. She told him that dinner was still waiting. The federal response, when it finally came in force, was massive. Operation Snowbound, as it was called, became the largest peacetime emergency operation in American history up to that point. The military deployed dozens of aircraft to drop hay bales to stranded livestock. Bulldozers and plows worked around the clock to open roads. Supplies were airlifted to isolated communities. But even this was not enough to prevent tragedy. The storms continued through January and into February. Each time a road was cleared, another blizzard buried it. Each time supplies were dropped, they were consumed within days. The operation became a battle of attrition against an enemy that could not be defeated, only outlasted. In the midst of this struggle, something remarkable happened. The disaster that had brought so much suffering also brought communities together in ways that had not been seen before. The isolation of rural life, the fierce independence that defined the people of the plains, gave way to something else, a recognition that survival depended on cooperation, that no one could face this alone. Churches became relief centers, schools became shelters, neighbors who had lived miles apart for years without speaking became lifelines for each other. If this story is touching something in your heart right now, pause and leave a comment. Write these words, "We endure together," because that is the truth at the center of this story. That is what the winter of 1949 taught an entire generation. Leave your comment now and let us know you are part of this community. The breaking point came not with a single dramatic moment, but with a gradual recognition. This winter would not end on its own terms. It would end when nature decided it was over, and not a moment before. The people of the plains could not control the weather. They could only control their response to it. And so they endured. They dug out and were buried again. They cleared roads that were erased within hours. They fed animals that might not survive. They kept fires burning in homes that might not last the night. They did these things not because they believed they would win, but because they refused to surrender. Chapter 4. The Response. By late January, Operation Snowbound had evolved into something unprecedented. The United States military, working alongside state and local authorities, launched a coordinated relief effort that would serve as a model for future disaster responses. The scale of the operation was staggering. More than 200 aircraft were deployed to the affected region, flying thousands of sorties to drop hay, food, and medical supplies. Military personnel worked alongside civilian volunteers to clear roads and rescue stranded families. The coordination between federal, state, and local agencies was imperfect but improving, lessons being learned in real time that would shape emergency management for decades to come. The hay drops became the iconic image of Operation Snowbound. C-47 cargo planes, the workhorses of the recent war, flew low over snow-covered pastures, their crews pushing bales out of open doors to cattle visible as dark specks against the white landscape. It was an imprecise method. Many bales landed in inaccessible locations. Some were lost entirely, but enough reached their targets to make a difference. For ranchers who had watched their herds dying for weeks, the sight of those aircraft was overwhelming. Grown men wept as hay bales fell from the sky, not because the hay would save all their animals, but because it meant someone was trying. Someone cared. They were not forgotten. The military also deployed ground forces equipped with heavy equipment. Bulldozers carved paths through drifts that had seemed impassable. Weasels, the small tracked vehicles used during the war, transported supplies and personnel across terrain that defeated conventional vehicles. The techniques developed during the operation would inform military and civilian emergency response protocols for years afterward. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the response was the mobilization of ordinary citizens. Across the affected states, people organized themselves into volunteer networks that supplemented and sometimes exceeded the official efforts. In Nebraska, the National Guard coordinated with local ranchers to create hay convoys, using military vehicles to transport feed to areas that aircraft could not reach. The ranchers knew the land. The military had the equipment. Together they accomplished what neither could have done alone. In Wyoming, church groups organized supply drives, collecting food, clothing, and medicine from communities that had been spared the worst of the storms. These supplies were transported to distribution centers, where volunteers worked around the clock to sort and package them for delivery. In South Dakota, high school students and their teachers formed work brigades that cleared snow from homes occupied by elderly or disabled residents. They asked for nothing in return, motivated only by a sense of duty to their neighbors. These volunteer efforts represented something important, something that transcended the immediate crisis. They demonstrated that the social fabric of the American heartland, often characterized by individualism and self-reliance, was also woven with threads of community and mutual aid. When disaster struck, people came together. The coordination between these volunteer efforts and the official response was not always smooth. Bureaucratic obstacles sometimes delayed aid. Communication breakdowns led to duplication of effort in some areas and gaps in others. Personalities clashed, tempers flared. The stress of the situation took its toll on everyone involved. But despite these challenges, the relief effort succeeded in preventing what could have been a much greater catastrophe. While the livestock losses were severe, they would have been far worse without the hay drops. While the human death toll was tragic, it would have been higher without the rescue operations. While the suffering was immense, it would have been unbearable without the support that communities provided to each other. Margaret Collins and her students were finally able to leave the school on January 7th, 5 days after the storm began. The roads to their homes had been cleared enough to allow passage. When the children saw their parents waiting at the schoolhouse door, the reunion was emotional beyond words. Margaret returned to her classroom the following week, though attendance was spotty for the rest of the month. Some families had been displaced. Others were still digging out. The curriculum seemed less important than it had before. She spent more time listening to her students talk about their experiences than teaching from textbooks. Years later, she would remember that winter as the hardest and most meaningful time of her career. Not because of what she taught, but because of what she learned about the resilience of children and the power of community. Chapter 5. The Long Thaw. February brought hope. The storms, which had seemed endless, began to taper off. The intervals between blizzards grew longer. The sun appeared more frequently, its weak winter light nevertheless a welcome sight after weeks of grey. But the crisis was not over. As the snow began to melt, new dangers emerged. The accumulated precipitation of 2 months represented an enormous amount of water. When it began to flow, flooding became the next threat. Rivers throughout the region swelled beyond their banks. Low-lying areas that had been covered with snow were now covered with water. Roads that had finally been cleared were rendered impassable again, this time by floods rather than drifts. The disaster that had begun with ice ended with water. For families whose homes had survived the blizzards, the floods were a cruel additional blow. Some properties that had remained intact through weeks of storms were damaged or destroyed by the spring melt. The psychological impact was severe. People who had held on through the worst of the winter found their endurance tested once more. But there was also recovery. As the snow receded, the full extent of the damage became visible, and with it, the opportunity to rebuild. Ranchers assessed their losses and began planning for the future. Communities counted their survivors and mourned their dead. The machinery of normal life, frozen for so long, began to move again. The livestock toll was staggering. Estimates varied, but most sources agreed that at least 100,000 cattle had died across the affected region, along with tens of thousands of sheep and horses. The economic impact on ranchers was devastating. Many families lost their entire herds, their livelihoods wiped out by a single winter. Federal aid programs were established to help the affected communities recover. Low-interest loans were made available to ranchers who needed to rebuild their herds. Emergency food assistance was provided to families whose income had been eliminated. The response was imperfect and insufficient for many, but it represented a recognition that disasters of this magnitude required a national response. The winter of 1949 also prompted changes in how the nation prepared for and responded to natural disasters. The inadequacy of the initial response highlighted the need for better coordination between federal, state, and local agencies. The success of Operation Snowbound demonstrated the value of military assets in civilian emergencies. The lessons learned would inform the development of modern emergency management practices. On a personal level, the survivors of the winter carried its lessons with them for the rest of their lives. They learned about the fragility of normalcy, how quickly everything familiar could be swept away. They learned about the importance of preparation, of having reserves for the unexpected. They learned about the value of community, of neighbors helping neighbors when official help was too slow to arrive. Robert Hendricks recovered from his ordeal, though he walked with a limp for the rest of his life, a reminder of the toes he had lost. He and Dorothy raised their children on the same land where they had nearly died, teaching them to respect the power of nature and to never take survival for granted. Thomas Garrett eventually returned to work, though he never made long-distance hauls in winter again. His fingers had healed as well as they could, but the cold weather caused them pain for the rest of his days. He kept the radio his rescuers had given him in the hospital, a reminder of the voices that had guided the helicopter to his buried truck. Margaret Collins taught for another 30 years, retiring in 1979. She never forgot the students who had spent those frightening days with her in the schoolhouse, nor the lessons that experience had taught her about courage and responsibility. These individual stories, multiplied thousands of times across the region, formed the human legacy of the winter of 1949, not just statistics and damage assessments, but real lives forever changed by what they had endured. Chapter 6. The Memory That Remains. Spring came late that year, but it came. The snow finally melted. The rivers returned to their banks. The land that had been white for so long showed its brown and green once more. Life, resilient and stubborn, asserted itself again. The scars, however, remained. Across the northern plains, the evidence of the disaster was visible for years. The carcasses of cattle, preserved by the cold, emerged from the snow as it receded, grim monuments to the fury of the winter. In some areas, ranchers spent the entire summer clearing the remains. The smell of death lingered long after the bodies were gone, but there were also signs of renewal. Calves were born that spring to the cattle that had survived. Seeds were planted in fields that had been buried under drifts. Children who had been trapped in schoolhouses returned to play in yards that had been impassable. The cycle of life continued, as it always does. The winter of 1949 took its place in the collective memory of the region, passed down through generations as both warning and inspiration. Grandparents told grandchildren about the storms that never seemed to end, about the neighbors who saved their lives, about the airplanes that dropped hay from the sky. The stories were sometimes embellished, sometimes simplified, but always remembered. For those who lived through it, the winter remained a touchstone, a reference point against which all subsequent hardships were measured. When later storms came, they were compared to 1949. When later crises emerged, people asked whether the response would match what had been achieved during Operation Snowbound. The winter had set a standard, both for disaster and for the human response to it. The official histories recorded the statistics. The death toll, mercifully lower than it might have been. The livestock losses, devastating but not terminal to the industry. The economic impact, severe but eventually overcome. The policy changes that followed, improvements in weather forecasting, emergency response and disaster relief. But the unofficial histories, the ones passed down in families and communities, recorded something else. They recorded the fear and the courage, the despair and the hope, the isolation and the connection. They recorded what it felt like to face nature at its most unforgiving and to survive through a combination of luck, skill, and the help of others. Dorothy Hendricks lived until 1987. In her final years, she often spoke of that winter to her grandchildren. She told them about the days when their grandfather was missing, about the terror she felt, and the faith that sustained her. She told them about the neighbors who shared what little they had, about the strangers who became friends. She told them that the worst of times can bring out the best in people, if people choose to let it. Robert Hendricks passed away in 1975, his body finally failing after years of health problems that traced back to his ordeal in the snow. At his funeral, the minister spoke of a man who had faced death and chosen life, who had lost pieces of himself but never lost his spirit. The church was filled with people whose lives he had touched, neighbors he had helped, friends he had made during that terrible winter and the years that followed. Thomas Garrett lived to see his grandchildren grow up. He rarely spoke of his 6 days buried in the snow, but when winter storms came, his family noticed how he would stand at the window, watching the falling flakes with an expression they could not quite read. He died in 1991, peacefully, in a warm bed surrounded by people who loved him. The contrast with how close he had come to dying alone in a frozen truck was not lost on anyone. Margaret Collins spent her retirement years in Cheyenne, not far from the school where she had sheltered her students. She corresponded with many of them throughout her life, following their marriages, their careers, their children. At her 90th birthday party, 3 of her former students, now elderly themselves, traveled from across the country to honor her. They told her she had saved their lives. She told them they had saved hers. The winter of 1949 is now history, fading from living memory as the last survivors pass away. The grandchildren of those who endured it know the stories but not the experience. The great-grandchildren may never learn them at all. Time does this to all events, smoothing the sharp edges, softening the harsh details, reducing the immediate to the historical. But something remains, in the emergency response systems that trace their origins to Operation Snowbound, in the community organizations that formed during the crisis and continue to this day, in the family traditions of preparedness and mutual aid that were forged in those desperate weeks. The winter may be forgotten, but its lessons persist, and perhaps that is how it should be. Perhaps the greatest tribute to those who suffered and those who helped is not that their specific stories are remembered, but that the principles they embodied, resilience, compassion, community, continue to shape how we face our own challenges. The winter of 1949 taught a generation that nature is powerful and indifferent, that human life is fragile, and that survival depends on more than individual strength. It taught that when the storms come, as they always will, the only hope is to face them together. The snow has long since melted. The people who endured it have mostly passed on, but the memory remains, preserved in archives and family albums, in the stories we tell and the values we hold. It remains as a reminder of what we are capable of when tested, both the suffering we can endure and the kindness we can show. The world went white in January of 1949. For weeks it stayed that way, and then slowly it returned to color. The white gave way to brown and green and blue. Life continued. It always does. But those who lived through that winter never forgot it. And as long as someone remembers, as long as someone tells the story, the winter of 1949 will never truly end. If you watched this far, it is because this story spoke to you. It is because you understand that history is not just dates and facts, but human experiences that deserve to be remembered. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and know who really likes the stories on this channel. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the resilience of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, then please like this video. Your like helps others find these stories and keeps this channel alive. And if you know someone who would appreciate this story, someone who values history and human connection, please share this video with them. Every share extends the reach of these important memories. Finally, if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, now is the moment. Here we tell stories that matter, stories of endurance and hope, stories that remind us who we are and what we are capable of becoming. Subscribe now and join this community of people who believe that the past has something to teach us. The winter of 1949 is over, but its lessons, like the best stories, live on. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering, and thank you for being part of this journey through history. Until the next story.